So we have Wilder Smith. Now you mentioned some of his genetic arguments.
Yeah.
The main so the one the points that I remember, because again some of that went over my head because he is very specific into the biology. He said that a biogenesis only happened once; it wasn't observable. Therefore, whatever it is, it can only be considered a scientific explanation. It's non-repeatable and non-observable. He also said that that's where he gets into the homology. He says speciation doesn't demonstrate the fact that we came from a single organism. He admitted that within species they could speciate, like the moths and the finches, but that mechanism could explain everything from amoebas to man. He said it couldn't. And then he also brought up the genetic code as information, which Edgar Andrews touched on. That was his argument. And then Smith, again, he grandstands. He just says, well, first thing, he says that the scientific whereas Dawkins was making fun of Edgar Andrews saying his scientific or mathematical calculations were false, Smith says that Wilder Smith was correct, that the scientific information he presented was correct. And then he just sort of, dances around that and nitpicks things. Now, the interesting thing here is that if we look at a debate and we gauge who wins and who loses, not based on a head count, but based on performance, if one side in a debate resorts to formal or informal fallacies and the other side doesn't, all things being equal, the side that doesn't wins. And what's interesting is that both Dawkins and Smith engaged in informal fallacies. So, for example, Dawkins says that Edgar Andrews engages in special pleading, and then he ends with the reputation of Oxford. Edgar Andrews interrupts and says, didn't you just accuse me of special pleading? And then Dawkins actually admits that, okay, he drops the point. That's interesting. That's a score in Edgar Andrews' favor. And then the other point is Wilder Smith says that creationists only look at what evolution can't explain, and therefore, sift through documents and texts and try to find and nitpick it to death. And Edgar Andrews says, well, isn't that what you and Dawkins have been doing to me? And then John Maynard Smith says, oh, but we had to because you were being dishonest. Special pleading again. So really all Dawkins and Smith can do is engage in special pleading, which is, would cause you to lose a debate by the terms of the rational discourse that debate establishes. The other thing that's interesting is that, again, the homology doesn't really get dealt with. The idea that, okay, no, actually, that's the point. Smith says that you're right. You could assume that homology is the result of intelligence, just like with the dispatch boxes. But then it explains everything, which means it explains nothing. But what's funny is Dawkins ends his speech by saying evolution is this grand, big, expansive explanation of everything, and that creationism is too small and explains nothing. So which is it? I mean, you can't say, well, one side says that, oh, well, that explains everything, so it explains nothing. But then, Dawkins says evolution explains everything. So by Smith's own judgment, that would also explain nothing. And so I think the whole debate hinges on this one principle of extrapolation of homology, design or common descent. And that's, again, why I think that the one student speaker, Peter Ross, is actually really good, because he brought that up. And Dawkins can't even answer it, which to me is kind of embarrassing. I mean, obviously he's heard of the idea of homology being explained by design. And Wilder Smith just kind of punts. And it's like, well, that's not very serious. So I guess what I'd ask you, Florian, is what do you think of the argument proposed by Edgar Andrews, Peter Ross, and John Maynard and Wilder Smith about homology being best explained by design rather than common descent?
Yeah. I think, first of all, when Dawkins says that evolution explains everything, that's him mistaken like many scientific breakthroughs that have been made that then turn out that there's a simple explanation. Doesn't mean that now there's like one overarching explanation for everything as well, right? That's just an assumption, and it may not be. If you do like the Occam's razor and apply that, you may still go into the wrong direction, right, and find very simple solution into the wrong direction. What I personally don't quite understand. I think there's no real difference between microevolution and macroevolution, and I don't think it makes anything. I honestly don't think it makes the creationist argument invalid. Like you allow for microevolution, but macroevolution is just a series of microevolution, right? How do you climb a tree? How do you climb a mountain, right? It's unsurmountable, it looks like, and then you just like one small step after the other. If you look at the humanoid precursors, like the Australopithecus and all these, how do you call it? Like the in the missing link between ape and human, basically. Basically, it's a very it's a very subtle development from an ape, from a pure primate, or from a primate that looks more like an ape to a primate that looks more like a human. So and that would basically, you end up as human as a species, even though it started out as a primate or even an ape as a species. So I don't think macroevolution is impossible. If you're able to explain microevolution with genetics, then you're also able to explain macroevolution. But I think homology can mean both. There's a common. I mean, there can be a common precursor, and that was created by something else than out of abiotic mass, right? So if you do the Miller-Urey experiment again, and you find that there is amino acids being formed but nothing else, yeah, maybe you need something more than just energy and abiotic mass to create life. But once that life is created by whatever means, it can go through a process of evolution and bring forth humans or other complex life forms just as well.
So one other point I wanted to make, I forgot about this. I wrote this down. This really just shows you like the level like galaxy brain delusion that scientists work with. So John Maynard Smith says to the audience, because they're going to have the vote at the end, don't think that because Wilder Smith leveled these criticisms of the Urey Miller experiment that we can't, and then say, well, we can't produce life in these conditions of the primordial soup. He's like, we're going to do it soon. He literally says that. And now 40 years out, we're no closer than Urey Miller was. I mean, these people live in an absolute delusion bubble that was 40 years ago. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't think soon is 40 years. I think that's like a couple years. But then the other thing is, so let's part of it is this debate didn't really allow for the complete unpacking of this. So let's go back to what I believe to be one of the centerpieces of this debate: common descent versus design to explain homology. Now, Wilder Smith mentions the time dimension, which is very important here. So let's look at, I'll just pick a wolf, right? It's an animal we all know. Now, with the level of species, so with speciation, they mentioned the peppered moths and they mentioned the finches. But what we don't see, right? Because the argument is, well, the microevolution is just on a long enough time frame will get you to macroevolution. Well, here's the thing, though. One is observable, right? We've observed the peppered moths, we've observed the finch beaks. But let's look at the level of family, Canidae to Felidae. We've never observed that change, and we've certainly never observed a change at the level of domain to kingdom or phylum to class. So the question is, of all the purported changes that would have to occur, man is only observed at the level of species and maybe genus, but certainly not family and up. And the question is, if we're going to argue this is a scientific theory, then there's two ways you can have science, right? You can have observation, so like nature, natural causes, you observe nature. That's obviously not test control. You're just observing the world around you. And then there's test controls in a laboratory. Now, in either of those cases, we've never seen changes at the level of family up. And then the argument would be, well, why would we assume that?
Well, there's some, for example, you could look at the green algae called Volvox, and this algae is part of a family. It's basically part of, I think it's several different species. and they differ in the number of cells one aggregate has. Like Volvox has one form that is aggregated as a sphere with another smaller sphere inside, multicellular. But then the same family, there's also a like single-celled algae, right? And researchers have looked into the differences across this family, and they found that the amount of adhesive molecules increases. Like if you get multicellular organism out of that one cellular organism, they are able to stick to one another much better, right? And then it makes sense, right? Then you get more clumpy aggregates later on, and so, but that's still not really a different species. You're right. There's just like you observe differences within a species, but you're never able to create a new species out of that. And the argument would be that I mean the time scales are just too long to observe anything. But I'm kind of like doubtful whether that is not a cop out, because you should have, I mean, if it's so readily possible, you should be able to observe these changes. It's more likely that maybe many changes have to occur as once, and it's very difficult to have many changes at once. Then again, it's difficult to explain.
So, but the other thing too, Florian, is to sort of, because again, with this debate, there's a lot of background knowledge that many listeners won't have, at least from the creationist argument, because that's just not something people are familiar with, right? So,
Right.
but again, like I said, this debate did hinge on homology is it best explained by design or common descent. So one objection was the time scale, and you're not able to observe it. That's what Wilder Smith points to with like abiogenesis. It's not observable, and it's not repeatable. Like you can't repeat it in a laboratory. And furthermore, even if you could, that actually just proves the fine-tuning argument, because it was a scientist who had a will and an agency who fine-tuned the experiment to create it. So even if they could create the primordial soup and give birth to life, that would just prove intelligent design. It would prove that you had to have, the fine-tuning of this entire experiment by a human being, right? So even if you could do that, it wouldn't actually prove the narrow Darwinian account. It would minimally prove the idea account.
It's very difficult. Yeah, it's very difficult to create a testable hypothesis where you switch off the random genetic mutation, and then you would still need to explain how speciation comes about. It's just very difficult to explain in the laboratory. So what you're relegated to do in laboratory settings is basically analogous settings, and then basically derive your wisdom from them. Like this Miller-Urey experiment is an example, right? You just create a similar atmosphere. There's no way that you can create the exact same atmosphere that was there in like a million years ago on Earth. So that's why it's difficult to prove anything in the lab, basically.
Right. Now the other component to this objection is that the principles of natural information, and that's something that was not fully explained, but was a centerpiece of both creationist arguments. And the idea goes like this: so the DNA molecule strand has 4 letters, right, that it uses, and that's a language which can then be used to program and code the entire biological system. Now, the argument goes like this, right? There are no natural processes that add information into a system. A natural process. So, for example, they didn't mention him, but there's a guy named Shannon who comes up with information theory, and the idea is you have a sender, a transmission, and a receiver. Now, information can only be preserved or lost absent some new injection of information. So that's why you have to have usually multiple levels of redundancy when you send a message for someone to receive. And then furthermore, the sender is a person, right? They have to have specified complexity, which is that information that they're sending out. Now, there's information in the genetic code, and the argument then goes, if you have natural processes which at best preserve and at worst degrade the information in the DNA, where did it first come from?